when I introduce Damien, it's an honor for me. When I met him first time in Sydney at Interactions, I met a young and a smart man who had a lot of experience in assisting people with disabilities. And I noticed he soaked up like a sponge every information he can get about Prader-Willi syndrome. And his goal is always to improve the quality of life of people with disability, and especially with Prader-Willi syndrome. And in this context, in the context of this goal, I think it's inevitable to deal, although with the need for restrictive measures, and especially to think about what might be restrictive even in daily life. And then, yes, that's the basis of his presentation, I think. And now, Damien, it's your turn. Thank you so much for presenting.
Oh, thank you, Hubert. It's so nice to see so many people from around the world, so many friends, all looking after people with PWS. Tonight we're talking about the big subject for Prader-Willi syndrome, which is restrictive practice. And so there's a number of, because when I first went to put this presentation together, I spoke to Hubert, and there were so many different topics to go into restrictive practice. And at first it seems a very simple subject, but actually there's a lot more to it. So anyway, we'll get started. So we started with really the Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability. And I just put this slide up because you can see that in the countries that haven't signed is very small. There's very few countries that haven't signed or ratified this agreement. So it really does apply all around the world. So I think it's relevant in an international sort of audience that we've got here to think about that. And so in the convention, people with disability have rights to fully participate to society and also for self-determination. So that's as a principle, it's as a general obligation, and it's also as a right. And it's all referred to in the different articles. And so there's human rights embedded in the convention, and such as the right to control spending money, the right to control to privacy, the right to make decisions, the right to employment, and the right to education. So when we think about rights, it's often useful to sort of think about human rights. And some rights involve freedom from other people interfering into your affairs. So that would be like the right to privacy or property or self-determination, the right to making your own decisions. And those type of rights could be referred to as negative rights because they involve other people sort of leaving you alone and not interfering with your life. And then on the other side, we also have rights that could be referred to as positive rights. And they're the ones that involve some action from others. So they're the sort of rights that need society to help us, like to participate in life, to be included, to be protected by society. So these type of positive rights are about accessibility to work, about the right to an education, internet access, as well as protection under the law from, say, a police force or the army. So these type of rights involve people doing things for you, sort of basic things that you should be entitled to. So with these two different sort of types of rights, there can be a tension between the rights of the positive ones where you need somebody to help you, and then the negative rights where you're people should really leave you alone and let you make your own decisions. And I think in disability, it's often because people with disability often rely on other people to support them, and they're relying on other people to help them achieve their rights. So that makes people with disability particularly vulnerable to abuse or to other people making decisions on their behalf, or for them not to be in control of their own lives. And I think if we're all professionals working in the field, we see this. We know that sometimes this is the way that things happen. And so the next thing that we sort of thought about is, well, what is restrictive practice? And the first way to look at restrictive practice would be the formal sort of legal way of looking at it. The way that we think about it as like in the legislations or in the rules that we follow. So the formal rules on what is considered restrictive practice vary around the world, obviously, but the systems are evolving, and the trend is often to increase the oversight and the formalization of restrictive practices, or to stop them to be used altogether. So this is really going back to those agreements that we've signed on the rights of people with disability. So now different countries will all put in formal systems in order to make that work. So some of the obvious examples of restrictive practices that are just formal ones that we would look at are things like locked kitchens and fridges, which is very common with Prader-Willi syndrome. Some restraints, sometimes it's an environmental restraint, or sometimes it's physical restraint if you're going to sort of physically stop somebody if they were going to attack somebody or do something like that. Some medications, such as the PRN medications, sometimes that get used in group homes, or even daily medications that get used. And then also restricted access to maybe money, or restricted access to knives or dangerous items. And some people even, or some people with PWS, it's even can be restricted access to the community, or car restraints or child locks. These are things that are sometimes used that are sort of formally restricted practices. So there's an ongoing debate on what should be formally classified as a restrictive practice. And these systems keep changing because it's not a set thing. That's it's something that's getting it's continuing to become more like evolve and become more complex. And so we're always having to think about, we always have to review it all the time, because there's always new ways of looking at restrictive practice and new rules. And obviously the rules will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So in Australia is actually a good example, because we've got a lot of legal frameworks around restrictive practices, and it has been changing, it's been evolving, and that's because it used to be state by state. Every state had their own rules, and now it's all coming under one national set of rules, and these rules are getting stricter, and but also it's always hard to understand. So because they keep changing as well. So when we're thinking about restrictive practices in Australia, some of the issues that we find is just trying to work out whether or not something that we're doing is a restrictive practice, or whether it should be formally considered a restrictive practice. So some of the questions that get asked is, if a medication gets prescribed, is it for some sort of mental health condition, or is it just for behaviour management? Because if it was for behaviour management, maybe it's a restrictive practice. If it's for a mental health issue, maybe it's not. Could some of the things that we've been doing just be duty of care, or could it be work health and safety, or even community practice to take those type of restrictions? And a good example of sort of community practice would be some of these COVID lockdowns that we're all experiencing now. That's a sort of restriction that we all get, but it's not specific for people with Prader-Willi syndrome or with disability. Is the restriction done to manage a behaviour, or is it done for some other reason? Is the provider taking the action, or is somebody else? So sometimes our formal system is more concerned with professional caregivers, but sometimes parents can, or medical professionals are allowed to make use restrictive practices, and that wouldn't really be considered a restrictive practice formally, but it's still going to affect the person if the parents are doing those things, or if the medical professionals are. And then also, who's authorised to consent to the restrictive practice? Because in Australia, if you consent to, the person who consents is allowed to withdraw the consent at any time. So if you had somebody with Prader-Willi syndrome who's agreeing to something like they're not going to go into the kitchen, or they're not going to eat the wrong type of food, but then they get really angry and decide, no, I'm going to do it, well, they've just withdrawn their consent. So that's an issue that we have to sometimes work out. Who is it that's going to make that decision that it can be done? So, and obviously the other side to that is if you don't, as a worker or as a service, if you don't obey those rules, then the consequences are very severe. And the consequences, I think, in Australia and probably all around the world are getting more severe, because there's more, society expects more of us as professional caregivers when it comes to this. But also, so then apart from that, and I think Hubert was talking about this before, there's also the informal restrictive practices. So they're the things that we do that restrict people, but they're not sort of formally monitored, and we may not even acknowledge it, or they may not even be acknowledged. And that sometimes it could be due to lack of funding, that we didn't have enough money to let people do everything that they wanted to do, but could also be due to the power dynamics, because support workers and people that run disability houses have a lot of power over the people that live in those houses. And so support, we always talk about people with Prader-Willi syndrome, some people with Prader-Willi syndrome being able to manipulate situations. But we also have to remember that it's workers and management also manipulate the people that live in their houses sometimes. And so some of these restrictions, some of the things I'm talking about is some of the rules that might be set in group homes that are sort of stricter than what you'd have in the normal community. Limits on the type of activities or the risks that somebody can take, limits on money or belongings that a person can have, consequences or expectations that don't generally apply to everybody else. And sometimes there can be lack of choice of food or routine or where they work. They might have to work in the same place as the people they live with, or somewhere that somebody else is deciding. Or they could be needing to fit, the big one is actually needing to fit in with the schedules of workers. So you might want to go somewhere and yet you can't go there because it didn't fit in with the routine, or it's got to be there, we've got to get back in time for changeover, these type of things. And there's also sometimes a lack of choice of where you can live, or lack of general freedom, or even parents can be involved and maybe they're telling the service provider or the professionals what should or shouldn't happen. So these are all restrictions that may not actually be formally monitored, but they still happen. So then the next thing that we really thought about, or that I thought about, is with Prader-Willi syndrome in particular, why are some of the reasons? What are the reasons that we do restrictive practice? So we know that PWS, it has a wide range of cognitive competence, social competence, behavioural issues and health issues. So some people with PWS have cognitive issues, and it makes them very hard for them to keep safe just in everyday life. And there's a big range of people. Some people with PWS don't have this problem at all, but some people do, and then they may need help to keep safe, or so there might be restrictions. For example, they may not be able to cross the road safely, not because of any other reason, that they just don't understand traffic rule, the way that traffic works, or it's a busy road or whatever. Then there's also another issue that can happen with PWS, is the lack of the social awareness. And this can make things awkward or even unsafe for people because they don't really socially have the same understanding of the way that other people might think about things or how they might be viewed. So this could result in eating from bins, in stealing, in public nakedness, trespassing, inappropriate behaviour, inappropriate touching, or bad language. So things that the people without PWS might not do these type of things because we'd be embarrassed, but maybe some people with PWS don't feel that same embarrassment. Then there's also the issues with the hypothalamus, the hyperphagia, like this lack of control around food, but also the lack of control when people get very angry. So this is a different reason that people could be, that we might be putting restrictions in. Then there's also psychosis that seems to happen a lot with people with PWS. So that's another one. And then obviously there's the health issues, and these are the things that we often point to with restrictive practices. Such as stomach rupture or chronic obesity, or what about insulin-dependent diabetes? That's something that we see with PWS, which is very difficult to manage because maybe that person needs to carry jelly beans with them, but then they're not able to control whether or not they're going to eat all the jelly beans at once, maybe when they don't need to. So, and then the final thing that we were thinking about is that also restrictions can themselves cause behaviours which in turn cause more restrictions. So, and the restrictions can actually result in dependency or lack of responsibility for a person's own action, and it just becomes a game. So the situation would be here, if we always lock the kitchen and we never let anybody into the kitchen, then one day we leave the kitchen unlocked. The person might go into the kitchen and eat everything, but they don't see it as their fault. That's your fault because you were the one that left the door open. So this just becomes a game and there's no responsibility, because if I go into the kitchen and I eat too much, that's not my fault. That's the support staff's fault. So that then breeds into this whole thing where the restrictive practice is actually causing the problem in a lot of times. So I think the important thing is that we need to really think about what it is that's causing this behavior that we're trying to stop, and then do we really need the restrictive practice? Because if somebody, for example, is running, can't cross the road because they don't understand about traffic, that's one problem. If somebody, for example, is running out on the road because they're really lacking social awareness, or they're after attention or something, that's another problem. Or if they're running in front of the road because they've got these issues with the hypothalamus and they're really angry at the time, and they're running in front of the road because they can't control their emotions, that's a third problem. And then the other one that it could be is maybe psychosis. So these are all different reasons and all require a different approach. So a couple of years ago, it's been so long since we've actually had a conference in person, but we did have the conference in Germany, and we did, restrictive practice was a big topic at that time, and everybody was sort of discussing it. And the sort of consensus that everybody agreed that we should have some sort of a model or some sort of a recommendation for restrictive practice for PWS. However, that model would need to be adjustable. It shouldn't just be one same model for everybody. So the type of model that we were thinking about would acknowledge that a person with PWS would gain further independence and skills as they move from childhood to adulthood. So just like any of us do, as a child, you need there's a lot of restrictions, but as you become older, you get more independence. Also recognize that people naturally develop and become more independent with the right support. So we need to help them develop. We need to help them become more independent. So we would need to aim at minimizing the restrictions to those needed to ensure that the person with PWS is safe, but also take into account that these restrictions will progressively allow them more independence. And to do that, we need to provide some learning opportunities by giving the person with PWS a chance to make mistakes, because we know that only if they make mistakes can they learn. You can't learn if somebody's always protecting you from ever making any mistakes, because there's never any opportunity to learn. But then also, we also need to make sure that we're not letting the mistakes that are really putting significant threats to the safety of the person with PWS or the safety of others. So we have to also be balanced that the opportunities are not ones that are too risky for people. So it really needs to be not a one-size-fits-all approach. It needs to be a model that understands that each person with PWS is an individual, and any restrictive practices will need to meet their individual needs and need to be reviewed, and those needs will change over time. But that requires funding, because we need to provide the flexibility for continued support and monitoring even after the restrictions have been lifted. Because I think all of us that have seen people with PWS that have gone really well and not needed many restrictions, but sometimes if you don't monitor or you don't keep involved with them and keep checking in, that actually things can fall apart, and by the time you realize, it's really got into a big terrible snowball where everything's fallen apart. So there still needs to be some support even after somebody's more independent, and so that would provide the rights to all people with PWS, including those people that are difficult to support. So we need to acknowledge that people with PWS do have a right to support. like one of these positive rights, that they do need us, and that what we don't want to do is to just have to get, like, not provide service to people because they're too difficult to deal with. So that's another thing that we need to consider, because sometimes people that are really difficult to deal with may need a bit more support and might need a little bit of more restrictive practices, but hopefully not forever, just for a period of time. So that was really my presentation, and I think it's more really just opening a discussion just to think about things. And some of the questions really are what types of, or some of the things that we still need to try and work out is what type of restrictions are really needed for people with PWS or different people with PWS, and could we come up with some actual indicators for when restrictions would be applied to the individuals? What types of situations would mean certain restrictions were in place? And then also, I'm just interested, and I think I've heard a little bit in the initial things, of whether the trend in restrictive practices around the world is the same as what it is in Australia, where it's becoming more stricter and we need to think more about these type of things. So that's my presentation. Thank you.